本节目由美国加州奥克兰市英记10家赞助播出，地址：奥克兰市第9街387号，订餐电话510-465-1888。各位观众，大家好，今天是2018年10月6日。我们现在在转播美国正在进行的一个直播活动，这个活动是关于美国法官大选的。
That, Mr. President, is why today is such an important day. That is why the vote we take this afternoon, a vote to confirm a new Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States, represents one of the most consequential decisions a senator ever makes. The members of this body are duty-bound to ensure we confirm justices of the Supreme Court who are men and women of the highest character and the most superlative qualifications. So fortunately, that is just the sort of nominee who stands before us today. 12 weeks ago, the President nominated a jurist who's been described by legal peers of all political stripes as a superstar, a serious scholar, and who is legendary for his preparation and possesses the qualifications, the temperament, and the judicial philosophy to be an excellent Associate Justice. The President nominated a brilliant student of the law. Those who taught and knew the nominee at Yale say, quote, "It is hard to name anyone with judicial credentials as strong as Judge Kavanaugh." They describe a true intellectual, a leading thinker, and a wonderful mentor and teacher. And those he's mentored, a diverse group of bright young lawyers who've clerked for Judge Kavanaugh, talk about his work ethic, his unflinching, honest advice, and his fundamental humility. For 12 weeks, the Senate has seen that this is not empty praise. We've seen the legendary preparation of a tireless judge. We've seen the patience of a committed mentor and teacher. We've seen the humility of a true intellectual who let his record speak for itself. Each of us has seen this for ourselves. Every senator who came into this process with an open mind has seen that very same Brett Kavanaugh firsthand. We've seen his brilliance, his painstaking thoroughness on display in the 300-plus opinions he issued on the D.C. Circuit. For 12 years, Judge Kavanaugh excelled on the bench that many experts see as the second most important court in our nation. We've seen his geniality and kindness firsthand in our private meetings with the nominee. Precisely the collegial approach that is so necessary on the court. We've seen his professional excellence as we reviewed more pages of documents pertaining to Judge Kavanaugh's career than for any other Supreme Court nomination in our history. Pages that depict a meticulous and dedicated public servant. And yes, we have now studied the results of seven FBI background investigations, inquiries that have produced no evidence whatsoever to corroborate any prior misconduct, but rather are consistent with all we know about this nominee's sterling character. This historically tall mountain of evidence adds up to one clear message. Judge Brett Kavanaugh is among the very best our nation has to offer. He will make the Senate and the country proud. He will serve with distinction on our highest court. He unquestionably deserves confirmation, and the
真的是
country
振奋人
deserves
心的时刻。
such a
说
Supreme Court justice.
这个法官是美
Now,
国人
Mr.
民最好
President,
的
as I've
礼物，
explained, the stakes are
太激动
always
了，
high, always
因为他
high,
给他一个清白，真的是给了一
where
个
a
清白，
Supreme Court confirmation.
而不是那些造谣分子搞的。
But this time, stakes are higher, a lot higher than they've been in the past. I can't sum this up better than our friend and distinguished colleague, the senior senator from Maine, put it in her historic remarks yesterday. This is what the senior senator from Maine said. It is when passions are most inflamed that fairness is most in jeopardy. She said, when passions are most inflamed is when fairness is most in jeopardy. We all know the events of recent weeks have strained the country's comedy and fanned the flames of partisan discord. But even more critically, our very commitment to the basic principles of fairness and justice is also being tested. Basic principles of fairness and justice being tested right here. A vote to confirm Judge Kavanaugh today is also a vote to send a clear message about what the Senate is. This is an institution where the evidence and the facts matter. This is an institution where the evidence and the facts matter. This is a chamber in which the politics of intimidation and personal destruction do not win the day. That this is the body whose members themselves uphold the same commitment to American justice that we seek in the judges we examine. A vote to confirm Judge Kavanaugh today is a vote to end this brief, dark chapter in the Senate's history and turn the page toward a brighter tomorrow. The chamber we are privileged to occupy is often called the world's greatest deliberative body for good reason. We're called the world's greatest deliberative body for good reason. When the rubber meets the road, when the hour is critical, when a historic precedent needs to be set, the United States Senate most often finds its way to doing what is right. Today, we can honor that history. We can vote to turn away from the darkness. We can vote to set a precedent about fairness and judgment that will define this body for the better. We can vote to confirm an excellent Supreme Court justice who will make the Senate and the American people proud. I yield the floor.
As a reminder to our guests in the galleries, expressions of approval or disapproval are not permitted in the Senate galleries. Under the previous question, all post-cloture time has expired. The question is on the nomination. Is there a sufficient second? Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. Is there a sufficient second? There is a sufficient second. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
The Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. The Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. Sergeant at Arms has restored order in the galleries. The Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. The clerk may continue.
Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Carden. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins.
The Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. Continue.
Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn.
Senator will suspend. Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. The Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. Two.
Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Mr. Donnelly. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher.
The Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. Continue.
Mr. Blake. Mr. Gardner. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Ms. Harris. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Heitkamp. Mr. Heller. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Jones. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Kyle. Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Manchin.
Clerk will suspend. The Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. The Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. The Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. Clerk may continue.
Mr. Markey, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass,
唱什么头啊？
唱个贝克汉姆的头
Mr.
型。
Schatz,
汉姆是什么头型啊？
哎，方便面头啊
Mr. Schumer,
这么短，怎么烫？
怎么大？这
Mr.
行啊
Scott,
这个头型行了吧？
这行，牛逼！行了，牛逼可了，香
Mr.
吗？
Shelby,
抖音记录美好生活。
Mr. Smith,
等会儿，什么酱面？
Mr.
海参炒面
Stanhope,
呢？玩儿呢？啊？
Mr.
光
Sullivan,
有面海参在哪儿呢？炒丢了。
Mr. Tester,
啊，扒拉出国了，让你造
Mr.
了，
Thune,
给我一个完美的解释。解释啥
Mr.
呀？
Tillis,
海参炒面，海参呢？我叫海
Mr.
参，
Toomey,
面是我炒的。
Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Wicker,
哎，美女，你看看你是不是手机丢了？
呀，真没了。
你手机是不是红色的外壳？
对对对，
然后上面还有一个小猪佩奇。
是你那是我手机。
我就说，我刚才看见你手机
My
从手
friend
里掉出来。
Senator from Montana,
我就说刚才路上压岁那个手机是他的吧？你还不信？给钱都要跟我赌。听大个人连个手机
he
都看不
were
明白。
present and voting. He would have voted aye. I have voted no. Hair will not change the outcome of the vote. I therefore withdraw my vote.
Senator has that.
喂，明天把太平洋买下来，我要
Senators
盖个游
voting
泳
in
池
the。affirmative.
对。
Alexander, Barrasso, Blunt,
太平洋可不能
Bozeman,
卖啊！
Burr,
我还要游泳呢。
Capito, Cassidy,
不能卖啊！
Collins,
你有病吧？
Corker, Cornyn, Cotton, Crapo, Cruz, Enzi, Ernst, Bishop, Blake, Gardner, Grant, Grassley, Hatch, Miller, Hogan, Hyde Smith, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johnson, Kennedy, Kyle, Langford, Lee, Manchin, McConnell, Moran, Paul, Perdue, Portman, Rich, Roberts, Rounds, Rubio, Sass, Scott, Shelby, Sullivan, Thune, Tillis, Toomey, Wicker, Young. Booker, Brown, Cantwell, Clark, Casey, Kuhn, Cortez Masto, Donnelly, Duckworth, Durbin, Feinstein, Gillibrand, Harris, Hassan, Heinrich, Heitkamp, Rono, Jones, King, Klobuchar, Leahy, Markey, Pascal, Menendez, Murphy, Nelson, Peters,
网友家养了有神兽，我不瞒大家说，我家养了2只神兽，我下面给大家召唤一下。
我出去一趟。
你干嘛去啊？
气死我了！今天花100块钱买了个包，明明是新的，回来之后发现是二手的。
你怎么发现是二手的？
你看看，这里有这么多钱，还说我是二手的，真奸商！
丽莎，你知道我和唐僧有什么区别吗？唐僧取经，我取你。
那你知道你和猪八戒是什么区别吗？
不知道。
没区别，没区别。
你要我怎么做，怎么说你才有？
喂。我这边那个，你媳妇发火挺吓人的，赶上恐怖分子了。和恐怖分子还是有区别，恐怖分子至少还能沟通。
亲爱的，快到我生日了，你要送我什么礼物？
你想要什么？
我想要一辆车。
买。
我想要这栋楼。
买。
我想要好多化妆品。
买。
你当你是土豪啊？
男人好难，做人好难。
哎呦我的妈！
我觉得我们男的出来聚会就不应该一直玩手机。难道我们的友情就这么脆弱吗？或许我们真的应该探讨下人与人之间，哎呀，早说嘛，真的。
如果我跟你爸离婚了，你选谁呀？
我当然选我爸了。
为什么不选妈妈呢？
妈妈里长这么好看，不找不到好老公的。爸爸可不一样了，你看他又丑又穷，又丑又穷。我得留下来照顾他，给他安享晚年。
Hello。
哎，哥们儿，头挺准呐。给你安排一场活吧。1场100，管送。
真假的？
真的，走吧。走。哎，哥们儿，扔挺准呐。
这啥活啊？这是。
快点。老公，你鞋带松了，我来帮你系吧。
哎呀！
老公，快跑！
怎么了？
分手。在这学校3年了，我把你们个个当成兄弟，而你们呢，竟然把我当爸爸！
我接个电话啊。
你好，先生，您需要什么？
哎，我想听听你们的宣传片儿，直接用电话放出来就行。
那怎么办呢？
你放吧。
放音乐。沧海桑田，乾坤巨孝，历经岁月雕琢，成就荣华福地。
山居未来中心高地，城市主干道强势贯通，沙漠辟城，第一人居处。
先生，你有听到吗？
行，我买一套，买一套。
好嘞，铁子。
每天都是学猫叫，为什么不学学其他的叫呢？我们一起学狗叫，一起；我们一起学鸡叫，一起；我们一起学驴叫，一起。
As a reminder to our guests in the galleries. Are there any citizens? Of the Supreme Court of the United States is confirmed.
爸，你是不是糊涂了？咱家没有狗，遛什么？
Majority Leader.
他遛狗，我遛你呀！哎呀，赶紧走吧。
President be immediately notified of the Senate's action.
Without objection.
I suggest the absence of quorum.
Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
现在议员们正在投票，刚才有点短暂的这个小小的那个抗议啊，但是又很快恢复平静了。现在我们正在现在正在实况转播，现在是个10、百、千、万、10万。现在有113177个人正在跟我们同步观看。这美国的法官选举一旦选出，它可以影响美国至少20年。这是川普总统为什么在大选之前选下他，他可以提前布局，可以保持美国政治体制的稳定性。好，这是美国投票通过大法官这个投票的整个过程，人们可以见证到美国民主制度啊非常伟大。过程中虽然有人抗议，但是都很快恢复了平静。好，今天我们就播送到这儿。 如果你喜欢我们的节目，请在视频的右上方扫描2维码。
支持华人参政，靠你投票行动。我们主张8020策略，也就是集中80%的选票，投给20%对加拿大华人有利的候选人。
好，今天的节目到此结束。
我们始终不扮高深，我们力求直播传真。支持华人参政，靠你投票行动。我们主张8020